My name is Bill Swantner. I'm a certified master gardener in the state of Texas. My membership is with the Bexar County Master Gardeners Association, and we'd like to welcome you to our YouTube series, All Things Gardening. This is San Pedro Springs in San Antonio, Texas. Behind that tree line is the skyline of San Antonio. In this park are the headwaters of San Pedro Creek, which joins the San Antonio River. This creek is fed by artesian springs from the Edwards Aquifer. For thousands of years, people have gathered at this spring to form community. To appreciate how San Antonio developed as a city, you have to have an understanding of how the Edwards Aquifer works. Today's speaker is Mr. Greg Eckhardt from SAWS. He is their unofficial historian.
With an introduction like that, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Thank you so much for having me out here today. So, at SAWS, I am in the operations branch, as it says there. That's the part of SAWS where we actually operate, run both the water and the wastewater systems. But I have this side gig as sort of de facto corporate historian. I've been collecting historic and rare documents having to do with water here for 40 years or so. And one of the things I have down there in the archives is this little pamphlet from 1924 called The Romance of San Antonio's Water Supply. Now, there is no city in the world where you can use romance and water supply in the same sentence, except for San Antonio, maybe Venice. But in San Antonio, I think it really is a place where people have this deep affinity and appreciation for their water. They know where their water comes from, unlike most places. They want to do the right thing to protect it. They just have this real appreciation for water as a resource here, which you don't see in a lot of places. For example, they put up money to buy sensitive tracts. This tract of land here was purchased to protect the Edwards Aquifer. And the citizens here have voted now to tax themselves 4 times to purchase sensitive tracts of land like this for the aquifer and also for the linear parks along the creeks now, Salado and Leon Creek and others. All that was done by the citizens here voluntarily taxing themselves because they really love and appreciate their water resources here. Now, we have this water story that's just so unique and colorful, and one reason that it's so unique is that our main water source is so unique, the Edwards Aquifer. And it's this very large underground limestone aquifer, and this dark blue area here is called the artesian zone of the Edwards. And it turns out that you can go anywhere in that blue zone and you can drill a well, you punch a hole in the ground, and you can get good drinking water delivered to your doorstep. In a lot of cases under pressure without even using pumps. And we don't even have to treat Edwards water. It's drinkable straight from the ground. All we do at SAWS is we add a little chlorine to it for disinfection, a little bit of fluoride, and that's the only treatment that we have to do to Edwards water. This is the reason why Edwards water has always been historically so cheap. And this also explains to some extent why San Antonio is so spread out. Water has always defined the geography of San Antonio. So developers always knew that they could go anywhere in that blue zone and drill a well and get water for their subdivision. They didn't have to wait for the city to bring them water mains. Like where I live in Helotes, the neighborhood was platted in 1964, long before there were any city water mains out there. So a developer drilled his own well because he knew he could get water anywhere and built a little water system, which then ended up being part of SAWS now. But that's historically one reason that San Antonio spread out the way that it did. So this Edwards Aquifer, there's no other resource like it in the world. There's no other city in the world that was able to grow to, going on 2 million people now, using an aquifer like this, where you can get water anywhere and you don't even have to treat the stuff. There's also a number of large natural springs that come from the Edwards Aquifer. And the early explorers and travelers in this area, they described a lot of these springs as these natural fountains, like sometimes gushing water many feet in the air. And this is the only one left that I know of that still has this natural fountain's appearance to it. This is one of the Bartman Springs in Austin. All the rest have been sealed up or walled in, or they're under a lake, or something has happened to them. Just this one that's left that still has that natural fountain appearance to it. Now, has anybody ever heard of the White Shaman panel? A couple of y'all? Okay, so believe me, I'm going to tie this to water history, okay? So this is a cave painting out just west of Del Rio, Comstock area. And this painting is 4,000 years old. And the Indian tribes, the natives in this area, they believe that one of the functions, one of the purposes of this painting was it served as a map, or it was a guide that they would use to go on a sacred journey to visit the fountain springs of Central Texas. They believe that these 4 dots right here, these 4 black elements, they're connected by this squiggly line that represents water. They believe those are the fountain springs of Central Texas. And this is a map that would guide you on your way to get there. These 4, they're strung out now along what is now I-35, Bartman Springs in Austin, San Marcos Springs, Comal Springs, and San Antonio Springs. And if you lay that portion of the painting over the aerial, it fits pretty well. So, I mean, they're pretty good geographers for 4,000 years ago. And the Indians were still doing this journey up until the 1920s and 30s. And I would always go out and talk about the Edwards Aquifer and try to get people to visualize what these places must have looked like back then. But there's no, I didn't have any graphics to show people. So a couple of years ago, I commissioned an artist to paint me these places as they might have looked to a family group that's on this sacred journey 4,000 years ago. The Indians, they were great about helping us with this project and depicting the people correctly and sharing their story. And they said, yeah, once or twice in your life, if you could, you would try to go on this journey. And they told us that they never went counterclockwise, they always went clockwise. So they would have gone to Bartman Springs first. And so that's the spring from the video clip. They would probably still recognize that site today. Bartman Springs in Austin, of course, the main spring is, it's actually called Main Spring, is what forms the swimming pool here. And of course, this is the holiest place in Austin, Bartman Springs. My friends in Austin tell me how much they love Bartman Springs. And I'm like, really? If you love the springs so much, then why don't you talk about taking out the dam that makes this pool and letting the springs be natural springs again? I don't have that many friends in Austin. Well, then our group would have come down what is now I-35 to San Marcos Springs, but the Indians called this place Yana Ahuac, means sacred springs. And out of all the sites around here, this is the one that's the most sacred to a lot of the tribes. They believe that this is where their people were born. This is their creation story. They tell me that when they were in their spirit form, they don't really know what they look like, but they believe that they were born as human beings, as people, after they followed a deer through the underworld on a hunt. And they emerged from these fountain springs under what are now Spring Lake. And it really bugs the Indians that the springs are under this lake now. But that's their creation story, so this is a very sacred site to the Indian tribes, even today. Of course, if you became a theme park, if you grew up here anytime between the 1940s and the 1990s, then you know that it was a rite of passage to go to the Ocarina Springs theme park. They had frolicking mermaids, Ralph the swimming pigs, Ralph. They had an underwater theater there that was like a marvel of the engineering world. This is Popular Mechanics in 1952. It was bought by Texas State University in the 90s, and it's all gone now. All the theme park ride infrastructure is gone. All that's left is the old hotel, which is now the Meadow Center for the Environment. And the big springs that were in that painting are right out here under Spring Lake in this area, about 12 feet deep. And the other thing that's left is the glass bottom boats from the theme park days. And that's how you see the springs today. The water has this exceptional clarity there, and the young people from Texas State give these really great tours. So you peer down through the bottom of this glass bottom boat, and this is a field of low pressure springs called cream of wheat. See why they're called cream of wheat? Some of the high pressure springs are so strong that you can see them trying to break the surface of the water from 12 feet down. So if the dam was gone, they would still be fountain springs there. This is the endangered blind salamander that lives there. Also the fountain darter, another endangered species. And Texas wild rice is an endangered species. The only place in the world that it grows is in San Marcos Springs and just downstream there in Sewell Park, San Marcos River. Then our group would have come down the road to what is now New Braunfels, to Comal Springs. And what we depicted in this painting was a dinner preparation scene. This fellow is cleaning a fish there on that rock. And we did that because when you go out to West Texas, where the White Shaman panel is, things are very well preserved. And you'll find rocks out there underneath these rock shelters that have like an inch thick coating of this hard organic shell on them. And it's from thousands of years of people skinning animals and making dinner on that rock. You'll see knife cuts and stuff. So there's a rock there at Comal Springs that has some traces of that. So we did a dinner scene there. These two springs right here are these two. So that's the rock. So the Indians might recognize this site today. This is the epicenter of water recreation in Texas. All of this is spring fed. No water comes from the city. It all comes from the springs. This is the New Braunfels tube chute. Right across the street is the Schlieterbahn. And then Stingy Falls, what we used to call Stinky Falls in the old days. So this is the combined flow of all the springs. And on this day, the flow there was about 200 million gallons. That's a lot of water. That's on San Antonio as a whole is probably using on the order of 250 million gallons today. So that's a lot of water. Somebody's going to ask me why it was called Stinky Falls.
Yeah, I was just about to do that.
Well, when I used to go there with my beatnik friends in the 70s, we thought it was called Stinky Falls because of all the weed. But there was a hot Edwards well there. When you get to the southern part of the freshwater zone of the Edwards, the wells turn hot and sulfurous. They smell like rotten eggs. And there was a free-flowing Edwards well there that gave it the name Stinky Falls because it always stunk there.
That's hot wells on the south side.
Yes, hot wells is another example of that. Those are Edwards wells. So then our group would have come down the road to San Antonio Springs. This is the Blue Hole at San Antonio Springs on the grounds of Eckhardt, we're campus there. And what we depicted here was a trade scene because San Antonio is and always has been on the geographic crossroads. All the north, south, east, west roads go through San Antonio. And the Indians believed that San Antonio was sort of a neutral territory where the tribes could come and they could set aside their differences and they could do trade and ceremonies and weddings and burials and all these things. So we did a trade scene here. But we also tried to depict something else in this picture, and it's very subtle, but it's this line of trees in the background. And what we were trying to convey there is the notion of a managed landscape. Here's where I see the ears of the plant people start to perk up. A managed landscape. And this came out of a bunch of work that they did on the Mission Reach a few years ago. They took out 8 or 10 miles of what was concrete, drainage ditch for stormwater control, and they're replanting it. They, put in a lot of the natural contours back into the river, and it's all replanted with native plants. But while they were doing all this work, they came across 3 areas down there where it looked like people had been living permanently. And that was a kind of a surprise to all the archaeologists. You always think of the natives in this area as being like very small bands of transient groups that are moving in and out and never staying anywhere very long. And they were surprised when the radiocarbon dates came back at 6,000 years old. So there's this sort of new emerging view among historians and archaeologists that we probably vastly underestimated the number of people that were here in the Americas before 1492. So there were probably a lot of people here, and what they were doing was they were managing the landscape. They knew that if they planted pecans, that the next generation would have nuts. So with plantings and with fire, this is a controlled burn on the Mission Reach from last year. This is how they were managing the landscape. So now the irony is, 6,000 years later, we are managing the landscape how? With plantings and with fire. Same thing. So this is where y'all come in. You know, we don't really have a choice except to try to manage our natural resources. I'm an environmental guy, and my Sierra Club friends get mad at me when I suggest that, you know, maybe there is no natural environment. People have been here the whole time since the end of the last ice age when these ecosystems developed. People have been here the whole time managing ecosystems on a large scale, much larger scale than we ever pictured. So, there's no natural environment to go back to. All we can do is try to manage it in a sustainable way, as you guys are doing. This is the blue hole at San Antonio Springs, the way it looks now. The blue hole is actually flowing right now. If you've never seen it flowing, water's bubbling up from the Edwards there. It's about 600 feet below ground. The Indians still do ceremonies there. This is also a very sacred site to them. There's all these other springs that line the banks up there. Besides the blue hole, that's one of the big ones. But this is another big one upstream, up at Cathedral Springs. So it's the combined flow of all those springs up there in the Almost Basin that historically formed the headwaters of the San Antonio River. So the river, it doesn't come from anywhere. It starts right there just above downtown and then historically flowed through downtown.
Is it at the Eckhardt Word College?
Yeah, Incarnate Word. So we have another grouping of springs in San Antonio called San Pedro Springs. It's just 4 miles to the west of San Antonio Springs. They're off San Pedro, across from San Antonio College. And it pains me today to have to skip over San Pedro Springs. In this very room, not long ago, I did a whole hour-long presentation just on San Pedro Springs. There's so much history there. It's where the city was founded. The Alamo was there first, just downstream, before it was moved where it is now. The first military presidio, the first civilian settlement, all at San Pedro Springs. It was the social and recreational center of San Antonio for a couple of 100 years. And now, most locals don't even know about the place. So here's a map from 1764, called the Menchaca map. And those two spring complexes in San Antonio, I've been talking about San Antonio Springs and San Pedro Springs, are these two green dots on the map here. This map is actually oriented so north is to the side. It's not oriented with north up. But those are the two spring complexes. And the blue lines, of course, are the San Antonio River and San Pedro Creek. And then the green lines are the system of aqueducts, irrigation canals, or the Spanish called them acequias, that they started building as soon as they got here to stay in 1718. They started building these irrigation ditches. And what they were doing was they were going up to the headwaters, up to the spring outlets, and they were building dams that would raise the level of the water enough so they could get it to flow down into a canal. And that was the water supply system for the 5 missions and the farm fields on either side for 150 years. Some of these things are still in use. This is the Espada Aqueduct down on the south side at the southeast corner of Stinson Field, and still being used. So across the top of this thing runs this canal, and still being used down, not for drinking water, but there's still some people who are using water from the canal to irrigate orchards and cornfields down on the south side. So almost 300 years later, parts of this acequia system are still operational and being used.
San Antonio Food Bank is actually using the aquifer.
Yeah.
The water down that spot.
Yeah.
We've got 50 acres there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like a recreation of a colonial era farm. Is that the one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a neat project. So, you have no hope of understanding the streets downtown unless you know how they're laid out in relation to the water supply system. So this is what is now South Flores Street. You can see it's paralleling San Pedro Creek. And this one over here, this is one of the irrigation canals. And this street is now Main Street. Yeah, so the water supply system, it was the grid or the framework around which the streets, and the city grew up. And this isn't, back then, this street was called Espada Street. And I think we should name it back, because every city in USA has a main street. Only San Antonio can have an Espada Street, right?
But the one that's just left of it says Acequia Street.
Yes, and there is also an Acequia Street now. Well, you know what? This engraving is from 1873. And yes, it was called Acequia. It is now Main Street. I don't think this street is here anymore. It's this one. It's now Main Street. So here's another map. This is two of the irrigation canals that start in Brackenridge Park. There were two of these diversion dams up there in Brackenridge Park. And this ditch on the west went to the Alamo, and this one went, this is the east side, and then this one on the west went over toward San Pedro Springs. But if anybody knows where the SAW's headquarters building is, down there on Mulberry, it's right about here, where the R is in range. But you see how the land is divided up into these long skinny tracts? The reason they did that was so that everybody would have some frontage on the canal system, because that's how you got your water. So everybody had a gate on the canal in front of their property, and the way you get your water was you pull the gate, and that's how you got water for your field. But the interesting thing was that back then, the land was incidental. It was the water that was important. So it was like, okay, here's how much water you get, and oh, just whatever land you can irrigate with that. They used to use deeds for 10,000-acre ranches in San Antonio as poker chips and card games, because the land was worthless without the water. So, but the way they divided the water up was not based on volume or gallons. It was based on time. They had this thing called the doula system. Doula means share or portion. So a doula was equivalent to about 2 days worth of water. And so when your time came, then you could pull the gate in front of your property and water your field. And why do I mention this? Because what do we do now during dry times? Wait for your day to water. So we are right back to the early water management method. I'm going to teach you all a colorful local epigram here. Today, if somebody is a little strange, you might say like he's got a screw loose or something. Back then, they would say, "Esta falta una dula." That one missed a watering. So the awkward thing about this Acequia system was that it was also the wastewater disposal system. And you know, people then, they had not made the link between sanitation and disease. There were these terrible outbreaks of waterborne disease in San Antonio over and over again. They didn't know what was causing it. And, you know, the cemeteries were literally full, and they had to open up new ones down on the south side. This is up on City Cemetery number 1. You see the Tower of the Americas back here? These are 3 children, all from the same family, who all died under the age of 5, about a year apart, each. That's got all the hallmarks of a chronic waterborne illness to me. So by the 1870s, though, people are looking at microbes under microscopes, and so they figured it out. They know what's causing this disease now. So they knew that San Antonio needed a more sanitary, safer water supply. And at that time, George Brackenridge was the owner of the waterworks system in San Antonio. It was privately owned by him and later by some investors. And he was there, and so he had a contract to supply the city with water, which is a very serious responsibility. And he was also the richest man in town, and he had money to experiment. And you know, just from looking at those fountain springs, the blue hole up in the basin, they must have known that there's this huge artesian source of water down there. If only they can drill deep enough and get to it. So in 1891, George Brackenridge did an experiment on his property on Market Street downtown, and this is what he got. This is the site that Anna was talking about where I did the tour. This was the site of the first big Edwards well for like a municipal supply. He got this geyser of water 20 feet in the air. So at this point, the city had basically an unlimited water supply. This is what made San Antonio what it is. You know, I always say that as far as historical places in San Antonio go, they got that barn on Alamo Plaza, and then there's the Market Street pump station. Because you laugh, but without this, we would not all be here without this well. This is from a water company a few years later. They advertised you can drink it in the dark. I hadn't thought about it before, but I guess if you're drinking water from a ditch, you don't drink it in the dark. This is another one of the early wells there at Market Street. This is directly across the river from the Hilton Hotel. If you can picture that, there's a water tank there, and it is still a major pumping station for saws. And most of the time, at that particular location, most of the time, there's enough pressure in the Edwards where we don't even have to run pumps. We just open the valve and we fill the tank just off of natural pressure from the Edwards. Here's a headline you could take from any decade. This one's from 1924. My news clipping collection goes back to 1870. Just tell me the decade, I can produce you the same headline. So, in 1924, now remember the water supply system is privately owned. It had changed hands. George Brackenridge sold out in 1906, and it was owned for a while by some Belgian investors, and by this time it's owned by a fellow in St. Louis. And the contract was coming up for renewal, and they proposed to raise the rates by 19%. And the citizens were outraged about this, and instead they demanded that the city raise $7 million in bonds to buy the water system outright and put it under city control. So that's what happened on June 1st, 1925. What we knew as the old City Water Board was formed. And ever since then, ever since 1925, the water system has been owned by the city of San Antonio, basically by you ratepayers who pay for everything. You own the water system now.
So we don't have to pay, right?
Yeah. Wait a minute. Maybe I didn't frame that correctly. So everybody always knew that the Edwards Aquifer was very large and very prolific, but it's not infinite. And everybody always knew that eventually San Antonio was going to need more water. Well, for 4 decades or so, maybe longer, the future water supply of San Antonio was going to be this system of reservoirs that they were going to hopscotch water across South Texas here up to San Antonio. And none of these were ever built. And the main reason was, if you're going to build a reservoir today, the main opposition was probably going to be environmental things. But back then, the main objection was about cost. This is water that you're going to have to treat. And it was going to be up to 15 times as expensive as Edwards water. So every time a proposal to build a reservoir came up, the residents here got sticker shock. And as a result, nothing ever got built. There was one reservoir, the Eckhardt Reservoir here, was actually started and then abandoned by the city. It was never completed. So as a result, it was just cheaper to just keep pumping the Edwards because there were no restrictions. There's no legal limits in those days on pumping from the Edwards Aquifer. We have in Texas what's called the rule of capture for groundwater. You can take as much water from under your land as you can put to a good use. That's the law in Texas, in a lot of Texas even today. That was the law in the Edwards region back then. So you're getting free water basically that you don't even have to treat. And as long as they could continue to do that, there's very little incentive to build some other water supply project, and these were all going to be very expensive.
Is one of those Applewhite?
Yes, one of these. This is Applewhite here.
Okay.
That was on the drawing board since the 1940s.
Oh, I see it.
So as a result, San Antonio basically did nothing for 40 years. This is a cartoon from 1984. Here's another one from 1984. San Antonio got this reputation as a do-nothing city that was just not willing to invest in its future water supply, because and actually that was a reputation that was well deserved. San hadn't done anything, And really, it's a reputation that the city had until probably the late 90s, when SAWS started to actually bring some water projects online for the first time ever, besides the Edwards. So that was the image San Antonio had, where this old broken down water system in the way of this Mack truck of growth that's coming. So 1991 was kind of a watershed year. This was the year that Rodney Puchek drilled his famous catfish farm. I didn't put any slides in here on that, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah, we just plugged in last year. And he demonstrated that the rule of capture was not going to cut it anymore, because he was using a fourth of all the water in San Antonio and getting it before we could get to it and stuff. So the other thing that happened in 1991 was there was a federal lawsuit filed over these endangered species. That the blind salamander, the fountain darter, and others that live in Combahee and San Marcos Springs. Because if we pump too much water from the Edwards here, these springs will go dry up there and the endangered species will die out. So there was a federal lawsuit about this, and the short story was that the endangered species won the federal lawsuit. Now, there's a side note to history here. You always hear that this was an endangered species environmental lawsuit. Anybody have heard that about this? That's the conventional wisdom. Well, I'm reminded of a travel log I read. There was these two guys they were on a pack saddle trip through Texas in the 1880s, and they were in San Antonio, and they ran across a veteran of the Texas Revolution, and he was telling them these wild stories about unbelievable things that happened during the Texas Revolution days. And they said, well, that doesn't really comport with what we've read in history books. And he said, this is not history I'm telling you, it's the truth. The truth was that the people who downstream from the springs, who used the water, who had surface water rights from the state of Texas to use the water that came out of the springs, they funded the lawsuit. They perceived that as the best method that they had, the best tool that they had to make sure that they had access to their surface water rights. This is mainly the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority that owns the big water rights. It's not really secret. They're upfront about it. Yeah, they had a meeting and they decided that the best way to get access to their water was an environmental lawsuit that would force San Antonio to quit pumping so much. So that's the background story to that. So because of this lawsuit, the handwriting was on the wall. That's, the endangered species had won the lawsuit, basically. This is federal Judge Luce's fund. And this order actually didn't stick. It was overturned a few days later by an appeals court. But the handwriting was on the wall that San Antonio was going to have to get in the business of developing and managing its water supply. And that's why SAWS was formed in 1992. And it was formed by a merger of three agencies. The old city water board, wastewater was being managed as a separate department of the city. I do another whole hour-long presentation on wastewater history, by the way. Wastewater was being managed by a different department, and then there was also a reuse district that was set up by the city to manage recycled, reused water. So all three of those were merged in 1992 to form SAWS, so that there would be one agency that was managing holistically all the water.
Is the federal government involved in any of that, on how good our water
Oh
supply
yeah,
is?
to the extent that we have state and federal permits that kind of oversee everything we do.
So they check what's in the water?
Yes, they come for periodic inspections and check it themselves, and you have to do a lot of what's called self-reporting, where you check it, and actually for the wastewater plants, we send them a report every month on the volume and quality of the water and such.
And
But-
what do they call the federal department?
Well, it's actually, it's called, on the federal level, it's called the NPDES system, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. This is a system of federal permits for wastewater plants. So it's a federal program, but in Texas, it's been delegated to the state to manage. So here we call it the TPDES system, the Texas Pollution Discharge Elimination System, and it's managed by TCEQ in Austin, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So they manage it on behalf of the federal government, if that makes sense. But it is a federal, at the highest level, it is a federal permit. So the first thing that SAWS did after it was formed was build a recycled water system to use treated water from the plants. This was all about conserving Edwards water. There's this old Chinese proverb that says, when you go looking for some water, it's best to bring some water. And we knew that before we go to some other river basin or some other water supply and bring in water from the outside, we had to demonstrate to the world that we're already making the best use of the water we already have. And the recycled water from the plants was water that we already owned and had in our back pocket. So it just made sense that that would be the first project that San Antonio would do. These are the yellow triangles are our major wastewater plants. This is 130 miles of recycled water pipeline. Purple is the color of recycled water. There's like a standard color coding scheme for pipes, and it's because so when you're digging, you know what you got when you dig something up. So whenever you see a purple pipe, it means recycled water. It's the biggest recycled water system in the nation, and the water. Sir?
That's no serious, isn't it?
That was Dos Rios. So about a month ago, we renamed Dos Rios to Stephen M. Klaus Water Recycling Center. Stephen Klaus was, I worked with Steve for almost 30 years. He retired last year. He was my direct boss. He was the chief operating officer for much of that time. He was my direct report. I was the direct report for most of my career. And he did so much for San Antonio that we renamed the plant after him back in May. My office is right here, by the way. So this recycled water system, we have about 70 customers. Like I said, the biggest in the country. The Alamo itself uses it on their grounds there. The Toyota plant uses about 1 million gallons a day in their painting shop. And one of the reasons they came here to San Antonio was because we could offer them recycled water that they could use. They wanted to be sort of a green company. We also use recycled water to create flow in the San Antonio River. This is our discharge. That was our discharge in Brackenridge Park, up there by the Blue Hole. That one was at the convention center. So on a dry weather day, not when it's rainy, but on a dry weather day, all of the flow, virtually all of the flow, 95% of it in the beautiful San Antonio Riverwalk comes from our water recycling plants.
So that's all wastewater.
So next time you're at Casa Rio, you can tell your friends that water was flushed about 2 days ago. I'm not scared to drink the water at the end of the plant when I give tours. We treat this water to, really for me, it's a drinking water quality. The only thing it doesn't meet drinking water quality on is nitrates, and nitrates are regulated for pregnant ladies and infants. So for me, I consider it drinking water quality.
So where does that water come from? I
Where
mean,
does
how do
water
you
come
collect it? How do you get it in those big pipes?
Well, everybody has a pipe. There's a pipe leaving this room to the sewer system.
Actual sewer, the
Yes.
actual sewer.
Yes, it comes from the sewer. We have more than 5,000 miles of sewer collection lines.
You need to take a tour.
Yeah. The other thing that San Antonio did very early on in its history, SAWS anyway, was aggressive conservation. And this, once again, this is about demonstrating to the world that we're making the best use of the water we already have. And conservation is still our cheapest water supply even today. But if you were here in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s and 90s, then you know this is what the whole city looked like. Your water was almost free. And everybody had a big green lawn, and we all ran through the sprinklers at 3 in the afternoon, and that's just the way life was in those days. You know, we have shown people now that you can have a pretty nice landscape without using a lot of water. This is my house in Helotes, and I don't water anything. As plant people, you know this. San Antonio is the only place where all of these ecoregions converge. So we have this, tremendous variety of beautiful plants to pick from, a lot of which don't need much water. So we have sort of, thanks to people like you, we have kind of successfully changed the face of the city now, where it's not a badge of dishonor anymore to have a brown lawn in the summertime. Just let it go brown. It'll come back. It's not even a badge of dishonor anymore to have a dirty car. So I think we really have changed the conservation culture in San Antonio. And this is per capita water use since the early days, since the days when it was 225 gallons per person per day. We're down to 115 gallons per person per day last year. So down by 40%. This is a huge success story. And, you know, people always ask me, how much water has SAWS saved or conserved? And I say none. It's the ratepayers, it's the customers that have done this. Because we've asked them to, you know, given incentives, but they have responded to those because this goes back to the love and appreciation that people have here for their water. They want to be good stewards of it and do the right thing. This is a receipt that I bought on eBay. It was issued to Mrs. Mary Menger of the Menger Hotel in 1891. And it says there she paid $4. It says for the privilege of using a hose for sprinkling. And she wanted to water her husband's burial plot. And on the back it's got a hand-drawn map of where she's allowed to water. It's got a long list of restrictions. It says you shall not suffer a hose to run freely. You may not prop a hose in the crook of the stick. So I show this because what we're doing now with, you know, water restrictions and charging people more for outdoor discretional water use is nothing new. Once again, there's so many ways we've come full circle in San Antonio. We are right back to the original method where they charge people a lot more money to use water outdoors.
How much did you pay for it?
I paid it $4.
Did you?
Which is exactly what she paid for. It's amazing what turns up on eBay. $4. So this is why this outdoor discretional water use that you'll see SAWS focusing more on now, because that's what's driving our peak demand. I'm going to show you in a minute, but you know we've kind of addressed a lot of the indoor use by giving away low flow toilets, and all new plumbing fixtures are low flow anyway. So, but it's still this outdoor discretional summertime water use. So the idea here is with our rate tier structure that if you're the one that's using all this water outdoors in the summertime, then you're going to pay more for that. So, you know, it starts out real cheap. This is $1.78 for the first 3,000 gallons. And the next 1,500 gallons is $3.11, and it goes on up. Where if you're using more than 22,000 gallons, you're paying $11.57 for that 1,000 gallons. This is about equity. This is about making sure that the people who are driving that summertime peak demand are the ones that mostly pay for that. Now, a lot of times conservation is framed as like an ethic. Like, you know, something that you should do to be, you know, just to be a good steward, and you know, I subscribe to that, but frankly, you can have an honest debate about that. You know, there are people who just don't feel that way. So what I want to do is frame conservation in a different way, and just take the ethics aside for a second. And I want to talk about conservation from the perspective of what it means to me as an operator of the system. So I have my finger on the mouse button that turns on the pump. And what conservation means to me is that I can manage this peak demand. This is our daily water volume of water to customers last year. So this indoor-outdoor line, that's not really scientific. That might be actually a little bit lower. But you can see that a large fraction of our water is used outdoors in the summertime. But as an operator, the thing that's important to me is this one, the highest number, 301 million gallons. And this is because in the water business, you cannot fail. You cannot have, like my brothers and sisters at CPS Energy, I've been hearing on the radio about possible rolling brownouts, right? You cannot do that in the water system. You cannot fail. The pipes have to stay pressurized at all times. So this means that I have to have everything in place. I have to have the water supply, the pumps, the pipes, the tanks, everything in place to meet this demand one day of the year. And the rest of the days, You have all this infrastructure sitting around that you don't use. And that's very expensive, to have all this stuff sitting around that you don't have to use very often. So that's what's driving the cost, is this peak demand. So when you explain it to people that way, from a cost perspective, it has nothing to do with ethics of saving water. It's just purely an economic thing about why you should conserve and reduce this peak demand in the summertime. Make sense? Okay. So 20 years ago, this is our water sources as of next year. And 20 years ago, you know, the whole pie, the green is the Edwards Aquifer here. 20 years ago, it was all green, the pie. But now we brag that next year we'll have 8 different sources, 15 different projects. I'm down to my last two slides here, but so I just wanted to show you just a couple of those other projects, water projects that we've done. If you haven't been to our beautiful H2 Oak Center, you should come down there. It's like the nexus of San Antonio water. There's all this stuff happening there with water. One of the things we're doing is we're storing Edwards water underground. We have what's called an aquifer storage and recovery system there. So in a rainy year, when we don't need all our Edwards water, the way it worked was we get so much Edwards water for a year, and if you don't use it, it doesn't roll over to the next year, it just goes away. So if you can store it somewhere during the rainy times, you can have it for when it's dry. So we do that here. This is what water in storage looks like. We have about 175,000 acre feet of water in the ground down there right now. And so for some perspective, San Antonio last year used about 240,000 acre feet total. So we got about a 9-month supply of water.
Is that a cave?
No, it's a sand aquifer. It's an aquifer called the Carrizo aquifer. It's made out of sand. So you can take water and you can put it in sand and it will stay there. You can try this like in your backyard in a sandbox, put some water in a corner, and come back a week later, it'll still be wet.
And the Carrizo's, isn't that iron water?
Yes, so yes, the Carrizo, that's the reason that on this same site, we have a facility to treat Carrizo water. It can be high in iron and manganese. And so we have this is the second water source here. We have stored Edwards water. We have Carrizo water, which we have to treat. It's not like the Edwards water, it does need treatment to be compatible with Edwards water. And then the third thing we have there is a reverse osmosis plant to desalinate water. Now way down deep, this is below the Carrizo, from 2,000 feet down, there's another aquifer called the Wilcox. And from 2,000 feet down, we're getting slightly salty groundwater. It's too salty to drink. It's not anywhere near as salty as ocean water, but nobody's ever used it before because it's just too salty to even give to your cattle. So we have a reverse osmosis plant, a desalination plant down there now on this same site. So 3 water sources on that same site down
What was that one called? With the water?
there. This whole place is called the H2O.
No, but the water that's really deep.
Oh, the Wilcox.
Wilcox.
The Wilcox aquifer is below the Carrizo.
Well, while you're on that subject, how about Corpus Christi? Do they use any water from the Gulf?
No, it's mostly all surface water down there from Corpus Christi Lake.
Like Brazos?
Yes, that one too. They don't. Nobody has a desalination plant on the Texas coast yet.
And
You know-
but is it a good idea?
Well, eventually, the reason that we can really do this because this technology gets better and cheaper all the time to do this sort of RO treatment. But it's going to get to the point where you could do this treatment fairly economically. But in the case of water from the Gulf of Mexico, you're never going to be able to get past the energy cost to pump it up to San Antonio. That's the part that it's never gonna be any cheaper to pump water uphill 150 miles. The treatment part is gonna be economical, it's getting the water here. So we have a water project coming online next year called Ridge, and when it's a huge amount of water, 45 million gallons a day we're gonna be getting. And when that project comes online in next spring, that's gonna be the last water project that we're gonna need in San Antonio in my lifetime.
Is that the one from Central Texas?
From,
Yes.
yes, east of Austin. So we do feel like all this water planning has done good things for San Antonio. I did this presentation at like a Rotary Club, and a lady came up afterwards, and I showed this slide, and she came up afterwards and said that she was a finance director at USAA at the time that this headline came out. And she said that they had a real conversation about whether they were going to stay in San Antonio, USAA, the biggest private employer in town, because they didn't have any confidence in the city's future water supply. Well, they're still here, so I feel like that has worked out pretty good. That's all I have.
If you have any questions about gardening in general or this video specifically, please contact our Bexar County Master Gardener helpline. If you'd like more information about becoming a Bexar County Master Gardener, then please check out our website. If you'd like to know more about the Texas Master Gardener Association, then please check out our state's website.